Okay, we are live. Okay, so since I'm the discussion leader this week, the first question is at approximately 2:40, the 2:40 mark, a voiceover asks, "Who do you think has a funny accent?" before showing a series of short interview clips. After watching the entire documentary, what do you think the documentary is trying to get at with that question? So, does anyone want to go first?
So when I first read that question and with the clips that followed, I thought that it was kind of pointing to the fact that we as people, like, especially in the United States, we differentiate what a person, where a person is from, and like how they behave based on their accents. So it kind of goes into like the later parts of the documentary where there are stereotypes based on the accents, but I thought that it was kind of foreshadowing that it would tackle that type of topic in the, later on in the documentary.
Yeah, I think that's like a really good point. Like, and my opinion was kind of similar. I think it was just kind of saying that to highlight a lot of the differences and like as far as people's perceptions based on just like voice dialect alone, and how later on in the video you kind of realized what comes with those perceptions as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for that one, what I said was the documentary is saying that, well, you might think that someone else's accent is funny, like someone else could basically like say the same thing about you. So like just because someone talks a different way doesn't mean that like their accent or your accent is like any better.
Yeah, there was that one part where it was like a guy from Ohio like talking about how if you asked him like where do all the funny people talk, you know, like where's like the funny accents, he was like you just go down like 70 miles. But then he said, but I guarantee you 70 miles that way they're saying the exact same thing about us. And I think that was the whole point, is just proving how like perceptions are so easy to change just depending on who you grow up around and who you interact with.
And one more thing, there was one where they talked about like the computer and like how it doesn't matter like what kind of accent it has, but like with the computer, like as long as you speak it, it doesn't matter how you deliver it, like it means the same thing. I thought that was like a good analogy from the documentary about how as long as we're able to communicate with one another and like understand each other, the accent is just a slight difference, but not something that is that super significant.
Yeah, like I agree. Like I feel like for me, like, and I'm guessing most people, we can understand people with either northern or like southern accents, and as long as we can understand it, that's really like the main thing.
Yeah, I think it also like wanted to highlight that like everyone technically has an accent. You know, it's not like just because you're used to one thing doesn't necessarily mean that that's normal. It's just like your perception of normal or like non-accent.
Yeah. It was like, which does bring up like an interesting debate, I guess, which is that is there a difference between like there being a normal accent and there being like a stereotypical accent? I wonder if like you went and you thought about the stereotypical accent as opposed to the actual accent from the actual region, how many times those are like the same, because a lot of people were saying like in the documentary, oh, like, oh, my accent is the like a stereotypical American accent. I wonder how we get there. Like, I wonder how those stereotypes are created because there's so many different regions. Just something interesting, I guess.
Yeah, I think it brought it up like a little bit about how like a lot of it is created through like media, especially like in movies. Like you'll see like a stereotypical like I don't know, for like a Californian, it's like that valley girl who, you know, is portrayed like not always in the most intelligent light. And so, or you know, what were they saying? Like sometimes like people who are like in prison or in gangs will have like certain like Boston accents or something like that, which is how a lot of like the notions that people have as far as like judgmental or making like an assumption of education based on the accent comes from a lot of media. And that's why like a lot of the what is like spoken a lot in the Western United States is considered like a normal accent just because it's more mainstream, because it's seen more in films, like most of them that take place in Hollywood. So people who have the accent of that particular area are the ones that are seen more widespread.
Yeah, like I agree with that. And they also mentioned how media can influence the way people perceive accents, like how people in the South are typically or like people, a lot of people not from the South consider people from the South to be uneducated because that's where like slavery was, and like they were pushing for more slavery. So it's just like how people perceive it, I guess. It comes a lot from the media.
Kind of going off of Andrew's point as well about the media forming opinions, or like opinions about what an accent is, what isn't. I know in Korea, like people that are learning English watch like news sources because that's considered like proper English. Yes. So I don't know. The documentary just made me think about how people in Korea like watch the news and like, try to imitate that, because that's supposed to be like the most like educated, proper way of speaking English. And that kind of goes on to like the later parts of the documentary too, where how like some accents are seen as uneducated and some accents portray higher education. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I know when I was traveling Europe and even when I was in South America, people who were learning English really wanted a British accent because that was what they deemed to be a more intelligent form of English. They didn't want the so-called American accent because they didn't view it. It was like considered you were more intelligent or you spoke better English if you could do it with what we would consider a British accent. So that's a really interesting point about how like if you consume the news, like I didn't even think about that when I was there, but they were consuming like British media and more like they didn't care as much about certain like Hollywood blockbusters. They wanted to watch like Harry Potter to try to learn that type of dialect rather than like, you know, Western United States accent.
Okay, should I move on to number 2? Okay, so does the documentary suggest a best accent for US American English? If yes, what is it and what makes this accent the best type of US American English? If there is no one best US American English accent, why not? Why is there not one best US American English accent? What do you think?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we were talking about, like it's so funny because like the newscaster, you know, they kind of do have an accent, but I mean, if we go back to just what the documentary was talking about, there was that part where there was the guy from like Ohio and he was saying, yeah, this is it, this is the American accent, you know. But yeah, I guess that would be it. But I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on who you ask, because for me, in my opinion, that's the white American accent, you know? So do we start thinking about, you know, like race and the differences? And, you know, I'm not sure if there is like one good answer, because if you ask a different person, they're going to have a different idea of what the perfect, you know, accent is.
I thought the documentary was like pointing to the fact that there is no best U.S. American accent or American English accent, because I think it was kind of leading to the point that like it depends on where you're from, and like we have these like preconceived notions about different accents representing different things, but to one certain state or town, like an accent might be seen as the perfect accent, where in another town it's a different accent that's seen as perfect. So I think it's all just relative, and they were just alluding to the fact that it's just relative around where you grew up and where you're living.
Yeah, they kind of said there wasn't a standard American accent it was just what was either like portrayed on television, or what, like just a certain type of dictation that was clear and almost without a personality. Didn't they kind of highlight the woman who did like the phone number voices, and that like she was considered to have like a more standardized accent just because it could be understood by more? So it wasn't necessarily saying that like one was right or wrong. It was just saying that like there wasn't a standard, but if there was, it would just be something that could be easily understood by most people.
Yeah, so I don't think that the documentary suggests that there is the best accent for US American English, because like every accent is different. And then like what Andrea was saying about how the phone lady, like some American accents or whatever are better understood than others. And it doesn't like necessarily mean that her accent is the best. It just means that hers is the most like widely understood. Anything else? Okay. So when I show this, or this is like the teacher, when I show this video in my in-person classes, some of my students tell me that they do not have an accent. They say that they sound normal, unlike people from the southeast coast or west coast, or people from a particular ethnicity, or people who are not local, etc. Do you think there is such thing as a normal accent? Why or why not? What do you think people are trying to get at when they claim that their accent is normal?
I think the claim of like I don't have an accent is more like I am local to this area, or like a sense of belonging, not necessarily that like them thinking that their speech is different. Because I'll say like even here, like coming from California to Arizona, I've been told so many times I have an accent, and I was like, what do you mean? Like it's only like one state away, like it's not that different. But I do have like different like ways of saying things that may be comical, I guess, to some people. But I think it's just that like because I'm not like a local here, so by saying like I don't have an accent is more kind of like claiming it's like this is your cultural space, or where you're local to, rather than just, I don't think people say it to like inadvertently be like, oh well, like my way is the best way. I think it's just saying like this is wherever maybe they may be at that time is where they feel local to.
Yeah, I totally agree about the whole like local thing. So I think like a normal accent is just like their way of determining who's from uh, their town, I guess. So like for instance, like if I go out of the country sometimes and I speak English or speak Korean in Korea, like they'll know right away that I wasn't like raised there, because I have a different way of saying things and like different accent. So I think it's just a way for humans to determine if a person is not from around where we are, and like a normal accent is just an accent that doesn't indicate any differences according to where you're from, I guess, or where you're relative to.
Yeah, I definitely. Oh, sorry.
You go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely think because my family is Persian, and so I don't know. I hear them talk a lot about like how my brother and sister speak, because I can't speak it, but they can speak it. But they have really American accents, and so just from the way that my grandparents and my mom just talk about like every time they speak Persian, they bring up how bad their accents are. So for me, I think at least in Iran, it's sort of like, or at least for Persian Americans or Iranian Americans, it's a matter of pride that you carried the accent over with you, even though you're American. But for Americans, and at least for our generation, I feel like we care a lot about it just because we care a lot about finding like our identities. I think identity is a really big thing for us. And so we just like to discover differences between other people. But yeah, I mean, when I go back to the question, I don't think there is any normal accent or anything like that. Everyone has their own accent.
Yeah, so I also don't think that there's one normal accent, just because like what's normal to one person could be like a strange accent to another person. And I think when people claim they have a normal accent, they are saying like maybe they're the most easily understood to like wherever they're from, kind of like what you guys were saying. And just because like it's easily understood to them doesn't mean it's like easily understood to everybody. Okay, and then question 4 is, what does the documentary identify as the source of differing perceptions and attitudes towards regional accents? Can you think of additional reasons why we perceive some accents as weird, uneducated, low class, but others as intelligent, sophisticated, normal, etc.?
I think for the second part of that question about like the additional reasons, I know we talked about it before, but I think the media is a huge part of it, whether it's movies or TV shows. But we like kind of create these stereotypes based off of the films and the TV shows that we watch. So like, for instance, like if we portray someone in a movie from California, that's like, I don't know, that has no worries or anything like that. Like we associate that accent with that person or that character. And then like, let's say on the media, we see politicians or scientists, and we see the way that they hear the way that they speak, then we associate that with intelligence and sophistication. So I think for me personally, I think the media plays a huge role in how I like kind of make the first judgment, I guess, of what a person is like. It's not the best thing, but I just think that the media is the guideline that I go based on.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and kind of like going off of what Daniel was saying is not only are you judging based off of what they're like, especially in media, like you were saying, are saying and how they're saying it, but it's also based on what they're doing. Like I remember thinking that every cowboy in existence came from Texas, just because that's how I had seen it in movies. You know, you don't have, you know, especially at like a young age, really, like you're supposed to memorize a map of the US and study it, but you don't really know exactly what that means, because you just make an assumption that other people like speak like you or act like you, and you know, kind of goes down the line as the domino falls, sort of a thing. But you know, if people with certain accent, like especially kind of going off of like when you were saying about like especially racially, like certain races are not like are perceived to have like really thick accents, and that's like sometimes perceived as either a lack of wanting to learn the language rather than just or like being good at learning a language rather than just like actually trying to learn the language, because it is a process. And even if you do, sometimes you still will have what people perceive as an accent. So I think the actions of individuals that are especially shown in the media make a lot of the perceptions about like, you know, it's not always like perceived in media, especially around like highlighting the African American community, why like Black Panther was so popular is because like you don't always see like African Americans portrayed in like a king or a queen role. They're most often like portrayed as slaves who were uneducated and not allowed to be educated. So you get all of these kind of like Daniel was saying, like a lot of the stereotypes and prejudice that you don't realize you're acquiring through media, but you are.
Okay, so what I said was like the documentary mentions how people with Southern accents are considered ignorant, racist, or uneducated, and a main source of this is movies and TVs. And people consider low-class accents to use slang, sort of, or like talk in like a different dialect, I guess, and consider them like uneducated for not using proper English. And so yeah. Okay, so
oh, sorry.
go ahead.
One thing I found interesting. So I know Andrea talked about how like, and we talked about how accents, like learning a different language and having an accent, kind of indicates where you're from. So like, obviously there's Chinese accent, like Indian accent, and all that stuff. One thing I found interesting is like when an immigrant speaks English pretty well, and they don't have a detectable accent, like people will ask like, hey, like you learned English really well, like where are you from? It doesn't really relate to the discussion, I guess, but I just thought it was funny that even though like accents play a huge role, the visuals as well play a huge role in how we classify and stereotype.
That kind of like goes back to the like "What are you?" video, where like if someone speaks perfect English, but say they're like Asian or something, someone might just ask them like "What are you?" Whereas like if they had like a strong like Chinese accent or something, like maybe people could tell, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, like just make an assumption if you have an accent, like, oh, you're not from around here, but yeah, I just thought it was funny. Like that sticks out is like, I don't know if you guys watch Karate Kid with Jaden Smith.
Oh yeah.
Where like he's speaking Chinese and the guy's like, oh, like I'm from Detroit. I don't know. It just made me think of that scene particularly.
No, I think it does like really relate to this as well, because it goes beyond just the accent. Like you have to like, so much of it is visual, so you make those connections and assumptions not only based off of what you hear but what you see. So like if you're seeing like a certain person that, you know, or a group of people who are of a particular race portrayed in a light and speak a certain way, of course you're gonna like get like conceived notions about it, like the stereotype that like Asians are smarter is like all the time portrayed in movies. Like I remember one of my friends was watching one of the Hangover movies or something, and she was like, you know, someone made like a comment about how like one person wasn't smart or another, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is like too relatable to like what we just read, because it was going just solely based off of like an accent, because it wasn't like a perfect English accent, and then like the actions that they were doing, not like, I know it's like a character in a movie, but still it was kind of what you're saying.
One thing that I thought was interesting was like blind people, since they can't visually like associate certain people with a stereotype, like won't they have to, or won't they like subconsciously just associate an accent or a way a person speaks as like intelligent or sophisticated or like a certain race? I don't know. I just thought it was interesting how like, because they don't have that visual guideline, I guess. So an accent would play a huge role in how they would initially judge a person.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think what they would say as well would have a lot to do with it. Like if you weren't able to see the visual representation of what someone was doing, I think then it would go not to like how, you know, if it was like media was portraying them, it would have to, then you're just solely judging someone based off of like the context of what they're saying, or the content, sorry, of what they're saying, not the context. That's a good point.
Yeah, that is a good point. I've never really thought about like how blind people would view accents and stuff, so it's like really interesting to think about. Okay, so question 5. This is the last question. Identify one concept from the module 4 readings that is applicable or related to the documentary. Explain to your team how you see this concept as being relevant and or applicable for understanding what the documentary is trying to say. Or do you want to go?
Okay, I'm gonna go first. One thing that I thought about was they talked about like discrimination and stereotypes in chapter 6. I think it was chapter 6. So obviously, like we talked about how people will stereotype and stuff like that throughout the discussion. But another thing was we talked about bilingual and multilingual. And I feel like with bilingual and multilingual people, no matter how hard you try, you're gonna have a certain accent, like depending on where you learn the language. So I thought that related to the documentary, in that people who learn a new language, unless they like grew up speaking it and have a really good sense of like hearing to talking, they would always be perceived as having an accent. But also like no matter where you go, like in Europe, like there's different accents of, or different tongues of Spanish and different tongues of Korean, like even. So I kind of lost my train of thought there, but yeah, I thought it related to bilingual, multilingual, and stereotypes and discrimination from chapter 6 and 7.
Yeah, so for that one, I put one concept in chapter 6 would be the study of the sound system, or sorry. The study of the sound system of language, so like how words are pronounced, which consists of sound phonemes and are meaningful to a specific language and which sounds are universal. This can be related to the documentary because many people use different phonetics and pronounce the same words differently. So an example I have for that one would be like, I say like drawer as like you know, the thing you pull out or whatever, but my roommate last year was from New Jersey and she would say draw instead of drawer because she had like a New Jersey accent. So yeah. You guys have anything?
Yeah, I kind of related to in chapter 7 when it kind of talked about the like cultural identity and cultural space, whereas saying like, oh, I don't have an accent is very much like part of people's like cultural identity, and how that it kind of goes into like the language you learn at home and the language like that's in, I think it's like talks about the neighborhood around you, and just kind of in school, that's where you learn the language. And that's kind of what the video said as well. It's like your language starts in your home, goes on to your neighborhood, then goes on to your peers at school, and kind of like, you know, escalates from there as far as like where you get it from and how that is tied deeply into people's like cultural identities and cultural space, or as you're saying, like that like, or for at least like some Persian Americans, it's considered like prideful to still have like a Persian accent. You know, it really relates to having like that cultural identity. Whereas like I know like my grandmother was from Italy and she didn't teach her children Italian because like she didn't want them to have an accent, because she wanted them to identify from like California or where, you know, they grew up. She didn't want them to have that attachment. So I just kind of found that, you know, relative, I thought, to the video.
Yeah, that's what it reminded me of too, that you really are who you grow up with and who you are around, which just makes the whole idea of your identity so vague, because, you know, your accent comes from the people around you for sure, but you may grow up with a family from a completely different place. So how do you identify then? But yeah, I mean, whatever you guys were saying was so good. So
okay, I guess I'll just review what we talked about then. So for question 1, sorry, just a second. So for question 1, we said that the documentary is trying to say that basically like sorry, just a sec. What do you think is a funny accent? Oh, okay. So the documentary is that was saying that like in the US we differentiate people and have stereotypes based on accents, which is kind of what they were getting at with what do you think is a funny accent. Then for question 2, we agreed that there is no best accent in the US. It's kind of just like each accent is different to like, or specific to an area. So like where you're local would be like your best accent, I guess. And then question 3, we said that there is no such thing. It's kind of similar to question 2, but we said there's no such thing as like a normal accent. Like obviously some accents are better understood than other accents, but each accent is different, and what's normal to one person could be completely like an accent to another person. Then for question 4, we said that So the media plays a huge role in how people perceive accents. For example, people from the South can kind of be considered or are sometimes considered ignorant or like uneducated if they have a Southern accent because that's where racism occurred. And that media also creates a lot of stereotypes with accents as well, no matter which accent it is, whether it's like Northern, Southern. And then for question 5, we talked about different concepts from the readings, such as like cultural identity. And yeah, so so for the next meeting, we want to figure out who will be the discussion leader and when we want to do it. So
has everyone else been the discussion leader already?
Yeah.
So I can do it.
Okay, so you'll be the discussion leader, and then do we have a specific date that we want to do it, or should we just figure it out through the chat?
I could check the date of when it's due real quick.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not
So
sure
she
what
hasn't.
to do. I don't know if she's opened the module yet. It's probably
She opened it, but it's she only has the paper. So
Okay.
spring break. The next due date is March 24th. So I would imagine the next due date would be March 31st or a week before, like the 17th.
Okay, so we can just figure that out with the group chat.
Yeah.
So we'll just
Wednesdays not work for anyone anymore, or I was just trying to see if like there was like a general day we wanted to try to do it, so then we don't have to do it like super late anymore. I know things come up, but if we like pick a set date, or I don't know if like your guys' work schedules change every week or how that works.
Wednesdays work for me.
I just can't do Wednesday like before 4:30 because I have to go pick up someone every like at around 12:30, and then I have to drive to school. But after class, I get done around. I get out of class at 4:20, so like 4:30ish, I'll be back in my apartment. So for me, like in the afternoon.
I work Wednesday nights, so the like 12 or whatever was the original sign up does work for me on Wednesday or like in the mornings. But if not, I don't have class on Fridays or like I don't know the weekends work. So generally, like, do you guys have class on Friday? Or
I have work on Friday, but I get out at like 3ish, so anytime after 3, I'll be available.
Okay. I can do that. I would go to work at 6, so I'd have to like leave my house around 5. So we can do some time between 3 and 5 works for me.
Okay, yeah, we can.
3:34 should be great, I guess.
Yeah, so we'll plan on that, and then if something comes up, we can just message in the email or whatever to try to figure out a time that works for all of us.
Yeah,
okay.
Great.
So since I'm doing the group leader, do I have to do the like record the meeting?
No, so I'll record it. You just ask all the questions, and then at the end, you summarize what we talked about.
Okay, cool.
Okay, sounds good. Are we all good?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, bye guys. See you guys next time.
Bye.